Hey there, everybody. Jeremy from the Seeds of Liberty podcast here again with another installment of Abolitionist Abstractions. Today, I want to discuss some issues with law enforcement. This is going to come about for a couple of reasons. Recently, here in New York, we have another highly publicized death of a so-called hero, as Officer Moore, I forget his first name because honestly I don't care that much. The newspapers call him a hero, and he's being lauded as being this wonderful man. And I just saw the headlines from the Newsday today, which I don't actually subscribe to. I just happen to catch it at somebody else's house. That the police commissioner is labeling him as a heart of gold and a true crime fighter. This is all ridiculous rhetoric, because as anybody who actually pays attention knows, police officers, law enforcement officers, whatever you want to call them, don't actually fight crime. They clean up messes after the fact. If a law enforcement officer catches someone in the actual commission of an actual crime, it is almost always by blind luck. The majority of things that they catch people in the act of aren't actually crimes. They have just been deemed so by some arbitrary edict that has made that action illegal. Now, this came to my home front this morning because as I was attempting to enjoy my cup of homemade caveman coffee, I looked out my front window to see a whole bunch of cars parking up and down my block. Now, this caught my attention for a number of reasons. To start, my street is normally not that busy in the morning. A lot of people use it for through traffic, but they don't park along it. As I continued to pay attention, I noticed that out of these seemingly civilian-looking cars, there was law enforcement officers pouring out of them like they were coming out of a clown car. It took me a second to register why this was occurring, because my first instinct as a voluntarist who likes to stick my thumb in the eye of the state at all possible instances, my first thought was, well, who did I piss off now? After that briefly ran through my head, and my wife saw what was happening and said, oh, that must be for the funeral, everything clicked. And all these officers show up for this service for this man who most of them had probably never even met. But they are lauded as the good guys, so of course they should stand together, and of course they should support their fallen brother. And the interesting thing is, with the amount of cars on the street, if I had done that, for instance, if I had a party and my friends were taking up the streets, I would get complaints from my neighbors. I know, because it's happened in the past. I'm somebody who, even before I became a voluntarist, never understood why the laws said that just anybody could park in front of your house and take up your, especially for somebody who either doesn't have a driveway or may have a shorter driveway and cannot fit all their cars. I never understood why it was legal for anybody to park there. But, I've had to deal with that for the longest time because people will just park wherever, because in their mind, if it's legal, that's all that matters. Doesn't matter what's moral, doesn't matter what's just. But the point is that my neighbors who have in the past complained about me having people park on the street because it inconvenienced them will now have no problem with these law enforcement officers parking their cars all up and down our street, and giving nobody who actually lives there access to park their car in the morning if they need to. So, that's just the beginning of the hypocrisy. The whole notion that this gentleman was a hero just because he was killed. At this point, that type of rhetoric is starting to make me sick to my stomach. Because when you unpack the actual circumstances here, what was heroic about this man? Now, I don't know him from a hole in the wall. I don't know his personal life. But he is deemed a hero just because he was a law enforcement officer who died in the line of duty. And that, in many people's minds, makes him heroic. But why? He voluntarily accepted a job where he was paid through extorted funds. His job is claimed to be an enforcer of all the laws, or as we know them better, arbitrary edicts, that are passed down by the politicians, most often without any input from the public at large. But then, most officers are told that they have discretion. Now, a lot of people will see that and say, well, that's a good thing, so they can let certain people, who maybe aren't doing such bad things, get away with whatever they were supposedly doing. Herein lies a problem. Officers of all stripes are required to swear an oath to the Constitution, one of our favorite subjects here at the Seeds of Liberty. And as anybody who's actually read that silly little document can tell you, that with the addition of, I believe it's the 15th Amendment, or was it the 14th, where, equality under the law was supposed to be set in stone. When the slaves were finally freed, and they were allowed to become citizens of this so-called great nation, which I obviously am not against the abolition of slavery, as I consider myself to be an abolitionist in the present day. And it was morally repugnant that people thought they could own another individual. But, what most people don't realize is that actually that amendment made everybody a specific type of citizen, a federal citizen. And now everybody is part of the great big old USSA. But with that equality under the law, which these officers swear their oaths to, how do you reach that equality when there's discretion? Like I said, most people will assume that discretion means a good thing because, in their minds, somebody who really isn't a bad person will be allowed to get away with certain actions. How does it work out in real life? Well, most of the time that discretion seems to be directed towards other officers, politicians, celebrities, all the people that get away with, in some instances, heinous crimes that will actually draw the public's ire from time to time, but they just chalk it up to the rich getting their way. Now, while that is true to a certain extent, how are they able to get away with this? Well, because some officer in that situation used his discretion not to arrest said individual for doing whatever act they were alleged to be doing. So when you have this type of discretion, how can there be equality under the law? Now, this is, of course, assuming that you believe the law to be anything other than an opinion backed by a gun. But for the more constitutionally minded, I would ask that you ask yourself this question. How do you have equality under the law with law enforcement officers that are allowed to use their discretion as to how to apply said laws? Doesn't seem that it would be possible to be very equal in that situation, would it? I don't think so. So, these officers are allowed to use their discretion, pick and choose who they're going to harass, threaten, possibly cage, and or kill based on their personal biases. Even an officer who claims to be fair and just cannot possibly be so if they're picking and choosing the laws that they are going to enforce. Now, I, for one, would be more than happy if the majority of law enforcement officers stopped enforcing the victimless crime laws, but those are the ones that tend to be the most heavily enforced by the majority of officers, especially here in New York. The so-called drug war is what fills the prisons, and people are constantly being harassed, caged, and threatened with death, all for putting a substance of their choosing in their own body. Well, those ones seem to get enforced all the time because, for the children. So you have this situation where these law enforcement officers are paid through extorted funds, which, by the way, doesn't matter if they don't realize that they're extorted. It doesn't make it any less true. If you walked up to your neighbor and told him that you were demanding a certain amount of money from him to perform certain services, some which would benefit him, some he may not agree with, but either way, you were going to pay for all of them. And if he didn't pay you, he was going to lock you in a cage, and if you resisted being locked in a cage, he could either leave his house or you'd kill him. Well, if you don't have the right to do that, then how does somebody else have a right to do that to you? So that is kind of undeniable that these are extorted funds. Like I said, whether they recognize it or not, it's a fact. So they are paid through these extorted funds. They take this job voluntarily to supposedly enforce the laws, which, as I've pointed out, runs contradictory to the oath they supposedly swore to the Constitution, as the Constitution, if we are to believe in its purported purpose, strictly prohibits them from doing many of the things that they are given orders to follow, like discretionary policies in relation to which laws are enforced. Flies right in the face of equality under the law. Then there is the matter of them being deified by so many estatists. Quite often, if somebody like myself even dares mention that I think this society would be better off without the current policing structure, the first response is often a false dilemma fallacy of, you don't want cops, then you just want chaos, and you don't want anybody to be protected, and you want every man for themselves. Well, that of course is not true, because as a voluntarist, abolitionist, anarchist, I believe in no rulers, not no rules. Another common objection is tied to that one, which I've actually seen T-shirts made to this effect by some law enforcement officers who thought they were funny. There's a meme that goes around about this. Basically says that, you don't like cops? Next time you're in trouble, call a crackhead. Which again is another false dilemma. But on top of that, I find it highly amusing because in order to try to make a point, they have to compare themselves to crackheads. How low have you sunk when that's the only comparison you can make to make yourself look better to the public? So they, as I was saying, they are deified. People think that the death of an officer is tragic. And here was this hero who, again, not only did most of the officers who attend the services for this individual didn't know, most of the public at large had never encountered, would have never known about had he not been killed and the media not plastered it all over the place and made this gigantic deal about it. He wouldn't have affected most of these people's lives ever. Yet he's automatically called a hero. And the statistics on this type of stuff make this even more insane, because it's so wrong when an officer dies. Although according to their own statistics, this year, for instance, so far 42 officers have been killed in what they deem the line of duty. 17 of those died in their car, in some type of car accident. Now, of course, those stories are not readily available on the sites that publish these numbers. You would have to go search each individual case to find out that in some of these cases, it was completely the officer's fault for driving like a maniac, even if he wasn't chasing an alleged suspect, and then wrecking his car and then dying. But that's considered in the line of duty. According to their own numbers, only 8 have died from gunshot out of the 42 just this year. Contrast that with the amount of citizens who have been killed by police this year, which, if you go by the official numbers, won't look that huge. But there are now independent sources who have started compiling these numbers, because many people in the voluntarist and anti-police communities have been greatly disturbed on the reporting of how these citizens die, and how it's always glossed over as, oh, well, they must have been a bad person and that's why the cop had to do what they did. Well, based on the independent studies, the number for this year, for the first 4+ months, in comparison to the 42 law enforcement officers, is 409. Last year, the number was put at least, I believe, 1,100. Or it might have been 1,400. I may have messed those numbers up. But the numbers from the last 2 years, from May of 2013 till May of this year, was almost 2,300, and that is underlined of at least almost 2,300, because since the decentralization of the statistics, which in most cases is decentralization is a good thing, but this is the one time that government allows decentralization because it benefits them. So since the law enforcement agencies all across the country are decentralized to a certain extent, the numbers are not easily obtained, and they are put on some kind of honor system to give these numbers to the FBI, which is why their numbers are remarkably smaller than the ones that have been compiled by independent journalists who have gotten fed up with the double standard and have began investigating themselves to find out just exactly how many times an officer kills a citizen. And since a great number of those deaths of the citizens are usually surrounding victimless crimes, that lessens the justification for their death even further. But again, most statists will say, well, the law is the law, and they broke the law, which is just such a ridiculous notion, because there's no logic involved in that whatsoever. Slavery used to be the law. You know, you ask that to a statist. If you were alive in the 1840s and 1850s, would you have been an abolitionist? Or would you have been sitting there saying, well, it's the law, and the government enforces the laws, so they say slavery is okay, so we got to be okay with it. You know? Before women's suffrage, women not being allowed to vote was the law. Jim Crow laws were law. The entire segregation movement was law. But most statists don't want to see that. They put blinders on and convince themselves that since it was finally reversed in these situations, that still makes it okay to say, well, now the law is the law, and until the law is changed. Meanwhile, over 1,000 people are gunned down, or more recently, like the case of Freddie Gray, thrown in the back of a van, handcuffed, and then given a joyride where he ends up with spinal injuries that lead to his death. Now, of course, in that case, the officers were actually indicted. Pretty sure that only has to do with the uproar and the rioting, because some of these mayors, politicians, higher-ups in law enforcement across the country, I think are finally starting to get the message that they're pushing a little too hard, and they are setting up the powder kegs across this country. Now, there'll be some that say that's by design. I don't really get too much into that angle because it doesn't really matter to me. The ends are what matter. I'm not a ends justify the means type of guy. So regardless of why it's happening, it's happening. And people like myself have to have these ridiculous ideas thrown in our face all the time that it's perfectly acceptable for the average citizen to be gunned down for violating some arbitrary edict. The most famous of which I think is being arrested for resisting arrest, because there's quite a number of people who have been arrested for just that charge, and then later on they try to come up with other things to justify their behavior. But we have to deal with this where, you know, you run the risk of death just about every time you interact with a law enforcement officer. If you are committing an alleged crime, doesn't matter what that alleged crime is, but if you are doing so and you know it, you know your actions to be morally correct or morally neutral, and you resist that officer's attempts to harass, cage, or threaten to do either to you, then they have a right, supposedly, to kill you. So, where is the justice in that? They have a right to gun you down for breaking some rules that you had no part of, and you were dubbed a criminal by the media and by the extreme statist sycophants that worship the police as if they are on some kind of holy mission. But when an officer, who by the very nature of their job is initiating aggression against peaceful people on an almost daily basis, is killed in the so-called line of duty, they are automatically dubbed a hero. It's sad, it really is, because people just blindly accept this rhetoric, and you are looked at as a crazy person if you dare mention any of these facts. You are looked down upon if you don't give reverence to these alleged heroes when their life ends due to a position that they voluntarily accepted, often unknowing of the true consequences. But again, that's kind of irrelevant, because intent only matters so much. When that intent allows you to believe that the ends do justify the means, your moral compass is so far off that it would be almost impossible to find you in a wide open field. So that is what we have to deal with. These individuals being deified because they were killed, but it's perfectly acceptable for them to turn around and kill, and they are quite regularly absolved in some manner, because the system protects its own. The system polices itself. And, too much bad press will get the natives restless and get them thinking that maybe, just maybe, we could handle things differently. So, that's about all I have for today. Thank you guys for watching. This is Jeremy from the Seeds of Liberty podcast, and this has been another installment of Abolitionist Abstractions. Peace.